Okay, so last time we were discussing geodesic uh, from extremization integral. So what we said was that in the Euclidean space, if you are looking for a shortest path joining 2 points, you basically kind of look at the minimum length path. Okay, so we would want to know how we would go about looking for a path which is uh, quote unquote shortest in the curved space. And since there was some kind of objection to using the word shortest, when I say shortest, I really mean locally shortest. That is because we have a length integral functional defined in this particular form. And when we say that the variation of this is zero, one is actually looking at only the local behavior of the path. Okay, so one is really looking at the locally shortest path. Okay, in fact, that itself may have multiple solutions depending upon what geometry you are looking at. But nevertheless, the statement that one is really looking at is a variation of this functional. Okay, in the Euclidean space, variation of this functional becomes quite easy. But in generic curved space, that means when G alpha beta is an arbitrary metric, then in that case, the localness of the variation becomes much more important, which you do not see in, say, you are looking at the Euclidean geometry. Okay, so to put it a little differently, after doing the variation of the length functional, uh, we are going to set this to 0. That is the way of extremizing the path. And when you do that, you get a differential equation, right? And we said that that differential equation, which basically sets this quantity in the square bracket to 0 for arbitrary infinitesimal variations. So we essentially land up with the equation, which is, these are the manipulations that we did last time, which is the geodesic equation. Okay, so at this point. Okay, but geodesic equation is a differential equation. Okay, and you know that the differential equation actually really gives you local data, that you may be able to find a global solution to a differential equation, which is perfectly fine. That's not that it is not saying that global solution cannot exist. But differential equation actually contains only local information, because you define a function at a point, and a derivative means the function is defined in the small neighborhood of that point. Okay, and if you take higher and higher derivative, it is a larger and larger neighborhood, but nevertheless it's still a neighborhood. Okay, so the very fact that one has written down differential equation is also an indicator that you are really locally extremizing the system. Okay, so in that sense, if I have to use Aman's language, I would say it is the locally straight path. Okay, so if one is looking for a straightest possible path, it is only locally straightest possible path. And that is the reason why the solutions typically are non-unique. You give two endpoints of the geodesic, there is no reason why there has to be a unique geodesic which connects point A to point B, particularly if the points are very far away. If they are in the infinitesimal neighborhood, well, there may be a chance of getting a unique answer. Okay. So, but the point of this exercise was to say that if you define a length functional and extremize it, okay, then the solution to that extremization condition is same as solution to the geodesic equation. Okay, so whatever is the solution with of the geodesic equation itself will be called a geodesic. Okay, that's the nomenclature, obviously. So to just get better understanding of this solution, as I said, it's going to be local. So therefore, we are just going to look at the local behavior of the system. Okay, let us consider uh, a particular point which is parameterized by lambda 0, and at that point, of course, x nu takes value x nu 0. Okay. Now choose a coordinate x prime which is in the neighborhood of x nu. Actually, I should have said neighborhood of x nu 0, in such a way that the coordinate system has a behavior such that in the prime coordinate system, the Riemann-Christoffel connection vanishes. Okay, so if you work in that coordinate system locally, okay, then your geodesic equation becomes simple, because in the prime coordinate system, this second piece is not there in your geodesic equation. Okay, fine. So the geodesic equation, therefore, at x equals x0 prime would be just containing the first term. But what we want to do is not really work at that point, but we want to work in the neighborhood of that point. So if that is the case, then the Riemann-Christoffel connection should be such that it vanishes as soon as you put x prime is equal to x0 prime. Okay, so that means that your Riemann-Christoffel connection should be of order x prime minus x0 prime. Okay, it is possible that it is not even x prime minus x0 prime, but it starts directly at x prime minus x0 prime square. Okay, that is possible. Okay, but this is just the weakest assumption that we can make, that if it vanishes at this point, it should be like this. Okay, fine. So what we'll do is that we'll use this fact and try to solve this differential equation. Now, clearly, as I said, if you want to solve the differential equation using one particular point is not good enough. You need a infinitesimal, but nevertheless a neighborhood around a particular point. Okay, so we are trying to solve this equation by writing down x prime nu prime, which is x0 nu prime, obviously, which is the original coordinate, plus these kind of functions. Okay, so there's a piece which is linear in lambda minus lambda 0. Remember, x0 is at lambda equals lambda 0. So when you substitute lambda equals lambda 0, all these terms are going to vanish and you land up at this point. Okay, maybe I should have put a prime on this also, x0 prime nu prime. Okay, because that is what I have used. Okay, so when lambda is infinitesimally away from lambda 0, then you are slightly away from x prime 0 value. Okay, so let's write down the analytic solution for this. You write down a nu prime times lambda minus lambda 0 plus b nu prime times lambda 0 minus lambda 0 cube plus dot dot dot. Okay, this is just solving it kind of perturbatively, small values of lambda away from lambda 0. Let's see how the solution behaves. Okay, so this is a nice exercise that you can do. And if you can see that the solution is written in this fashion, there is no quadratic term sitting out here. Okay, so you can add a quadratic term lambda minus lambda 0 square to this solution. Okay, right, say c nu prime times lambda minus lambda 0 squared, and you can check actually that it does not satisfy the equation of motion defined at lambda minus equals lambda 0. Okay, so when I say equation of motion at lambda equals lambda 0 means this equation of motion, because you have to differential equation will take you infinitesimally away from lambda 0. Okay, so you can check that the quadratic piece is not a solution. That is the reason why that is a piece missing out here. Okay, fine. It's kind of a straightforward exercise, but it's quite instructive to do that. Okay, so let's kind of try to choose a frame in such a way that that the motion in the prime coordinate system is along one particular direction. Okay, so instead of writing nu prime or some such thing, let's choose one particular direction. So I choose that to be 1 prime. Okay, so suppose you choose that direction, then this equation can be inverted. Okay, now of course, as I said, it's a perturbative statement. So what you can do is you can say that the cubic term is small because lambda minus lambda 0 is small. So cubic term is small, you use this to invert. Okay, so you can easily see that the first term is just setting b equals 0 and take lambda minus lambda 0 is equal to x minus x0 upon a. Okay, and since the motion is taken to be in one direction, I can just choose that direction and it's easy to write down this solution there. Okay, now if lambda minus lambda 0 is like this, then lambda minus lambda 0 cube would be like x minus x prime 1 prime minus x 0 prime 1 prime cube. So that is a kind of roughly the power of the correction that you would have in writing lambda minus lambda 0 in terms of coordinates. Okay, fine. So what we'll do is we'll take this and put it back into the equation. Okay. So if you put it back in the equation, then you get something like this. Okay, just substitute lambda minus lambda 0. But now, of course, the solution is for generic nu, right? So therefore, x prime nu prime is x0 prime nu prime plus a nu prime upon a1 prime times x prime 1 minus x0 prime 1 kind of stuff. And then there are the corrections at cubic order. Okay, fine. But now you see that if you look at this equation, this is a local equation because we are choosing lambda minus lambda 0 small, and therefore, and given that the equation is a differential equation, implies that locally the quantity is differentiable. So therefore, you would expect if lambda minus lambda 0 is small, x minus x0 also would be small. Okay, and in that case, this equation is basically an equation of straight line because nu prime direction in x prime coordinate system depend on 1 prime direction linearly. Okay, and this is the slope of that line. Okay, so therefore, in any local coordinate system, you can show that the geodesic essentially reduces to a straight line. Okay, so in that sense, one could say that it is a locally straightest path, following what we discussed last time. Okay, fine. So, but of course, we know that the local coordinate system at a particular point is really the coordinate system of the tangent space at that point. Okay, so you pick a particular point, you just look at the tangent space. That is the choice of local coordinate system. Within that local coordinate system, of course, you have additional choice by where you can rotate the coordinate system with respect to the original coordinate system, which corresponds to kind of freedom of, choosing the direction of the axis or something. Okay, fine. So, so what we find is that there is essentially one-to-one correspondence between the geodesic, which is passing through a particular point, and a vector in a tangent space. Okay, because every tangent vector is basically a local straight line, and therefore any tangent vector that you draw at x0 prime tells you a direction of a geodesic passing through that point and is tangent to that vector. Okay, so effectively, if you are in higher dimension, you have essentially infinite number of geodesics passing through a particular point. Okay, so is this okay? Any questions about this? Okay, yeah, is there a question? Okay, if not, then let's go ahead. So what we'll do now is we'll try to take non-relativistic limit of the geodesic equation. And so for that, when we say non-relativistic limit, we mean that the spatial velocity, spatial components of velocity are small compared to the temporal component. Excuse me. And in this parameterization, that statement corresponds to dxi by d lambda is much smaller than dt by d lambda. Okay. So of course, this equation, the original geodesic equation, is of course covariant. But now when you take non-relativistic limit, you make this distinction. You say that the spatial variations are slower than the temporal variation. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll substitute this back into the equation, and we would ask, okay, what happens when you take non-relativistic limit? And in the non-relativistic limit, therefore, we would basically reduce this dx mu by d lambda, dx mu by dx sigma by d lambda fellows, okay, into dt by d lambda essentially, because those are the dominant quantities. Okay. So what you get is an equation which is the second derivative of the coordinate plus gamma nu 0 0 dt by d lambda squared equals 0. Okay. Now we had defined gamma earlier in terms of metric. So we use that same definition and write down gamma nu 0 0 to be half of g nu sigma times the derivatives of the metric. Okay. So all I have done is basically just copied the expression and pick the zero component appropriately. Okay. So this is how it will appear. Okay. Fine. So what we want to do is actually assume that the gravitational field is static. That means by static I mean that the metric does any component of the metric does not depend on time. So if you take a time derivative, that would just vanish. Okay. So if you do that, okay, so this is like, you are taking non-relativistic limit and at the same time you are taking, time independent metric components. Okay. So now it is not necessary to do this when you take non-relativistic limit, but the kind of problem that we are looking at, we basically are looking at static gravitational field. But you may want to consider a non-relativistic limit of two gravitating bodies moving in certain direction and influencing each other. In that case, of course, the gravitational field would be a function of time, but we will not do that right now. Okay. Fine. So if you choose the metric to be static, that means time derivatives are going to vanish, then g nu 0 0 simplifies into this expression, just minus half times this last piece. Okay. Fine. Okay. So now if you say that the gravitational field is weak, then we can choose to expand g mu nu around eta mu nu. Since I have written g nu sigma here, I am using the same indices. Okay. So if you do that, then g nu sigma could be written as eta nu sigma plus h nu sigma, which is a deviation from the Minkowski metric. Okay. This is how the small deviation of the metric component would be written. We want to write down the inverse metric component. So that would become g nu sigma is equal to eta nu sigma minus h nu sigma. Okay. So now this statement is of course correct only up to a particular order. But if you multiply this g nu sigma covariant with say g nu rho contravariant, then you will find that the leading piece of course gives you 1. Okay, which is, since it's an inverse metric, you expect that to happen. A term of at order h would vanish. Okay, of course, where h h upstairs is defined in this particular fashion. Okay, so this is a way of writing upstairs indices using the Minkowski metric to raise and lower indices. Works only when you are working in weak gravitational field. By that I mean that if h nu sigma is small compared to eta nu sigma, then you say that indices are raised and lowered by the quote unquote background metric, and the fluctuation, which is what you would want to call h nu sigma. Okay, those indices do not play any role. Those components do not play any role in raising and lowering indices. This is perfectly okay when one does perturbation theory. Okay. So anyway, coming back to what I was saying, was this g times g inverse should have been 1, which of course comes out when you take product of two etas. But then there are terms which are proportional to h. Terms linear in h would vanish, they would cancel out. Then there is a term which is quadratic in h, okay, and that of course doesn't vanish, but that would require your g inverse to have a correction which is quadratic in h, and so on. Okay, but we will not go to that level of detail because we are assuming that these quantities are small. Okay, fine. So using this, you could kind of you can plug this back into the Riemann-Christoffel connection, and to leading order. By leading order, I mean to linear order in the perturbation in the fluctuation h. gamma nu 0, 0 can be written as eta. Remember, there is a g here, okay? But if you write down g to be this entire piece, then since derivative of g 0, 0 would require h 0, 0 to get in, because derivative of eta would be 0. So there is already a h here. If you write down g inverse to be this entire quantity up there, okay, which is already approximate as I was just explaining, okay, but nevertheless, if you put entire quantity up there, then you get one term which is eta times derivative of h 0, 0, which is what I have written down here, okay. But then there is another term which is h times derivative of h 0, 0, but that term is quadratic in h, okay. So to linear order in linear approximation, okay, this would suffice, okay. Now, of course, if you want to do more accurate computation, one way to do it is do fully covariant computation. If you want to really do it in the correction to the non-relativistic limit in weak field approximation, then you can systematically add terms which are quadratic in H and cubic in H and so on. Okay. Any questions here? Okay, if not, then let me go ahead. Okay, so if you use this gamma nu 0, 0 back in the non-relativistic version of geodesic equation, then the geodesic equation takes this form. Okay, now remember gamma has a minus sign, so that's why I just pulled this equation on the other side and removed the sign. Okay, fine. So the static answer of the metric, of course, says one more thing, that h00 is time independent. So therefore, if when you look at the sigma derivative, okay, you are looking at only spatial derivative, and you are not looking at the temporal derivative in that case. Okay. Now, if you said time derivative of h00 equals 0, then remember eta was diagonal. So if sigma is 0, nu is also 0. Okay. So that means second derivative of x0 with respect to lambda would just vanish, because the right hand side vanishes. This entire piece goes away. Okay. Fine. So this tells you that in the non-relativistic limit, you can do a linear identification between t and lambda. Okay. This just solves as a linear solution. T is equal to some constant times lambda plus lambda naught or something like that. Okay. Fine. So that is one of the reasons why in the non-relativistic problems, we don't use a parametric equation. We directly write down, say, derivative of x with respect to time itself, and not dxi by d lambda and dt by d lambda kind of equations. Okay. Fine. So let's come back to the spatial component. That means when nu is not equal to 0, then because eta is diagonal, you get this equation. Okay. Fine. But we already know that dt by d lambda is constant. Okay. So we could just kind of put in a factor there and be done with that. Okay. So, okay. But what we will try to do is basically just multiply this entire equation by d lambda by dt, so that you can push this quantity on the left hand side. Okay. Doing that would allow us to bring this entire equation into the non-relativistic equation form, namely not have any parameters sitting around and write the variation of spatial coordinates with respect to time. Okay. So of course you could have substituted dt by d lambda equals constant here. Okay, and then replace this lambda as a linear function of t, and it would have brought you here again. So it's the same stuff. We are not doing anything different really. Okay, fine. So you get an equation of this kind, and what we want to do is to compare that with Newton's law of gravitation. Okay, so Newton's law says that the acceleration due to gravity is related to the gradient of the gravitational potential. Okay, fine. And of course, the relation is between the acceleration and the gradient has a negative sign, because force is equal to minus negative of the gradient of the gravitational potential. So therefore, we want a negative sign here, but with respect to gravitational potential, so you identify H00 to be minus 2 times the gravitational potential. The factor of 2 is of course just to soak up this half. Okay. So what we have learned is that if you are trying to look at weak field approximation of uh, of the of the curved space, and if you take non-relativistic limit, then it tells you that the 0, 0 component of the metric, namely G00, is given by -1, -2, 5. -1 because that is eta 00, and -2, 5 is H00. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. If not, then we can go ahead. So this is what I was just saying, that so what we have found by doing this is that if you look at the space time which is curved, that is what we meant by doing the expansion around Minkowski space, where the function h mu nu was a function of coordinates. Okay, then that uh, description of a curved space time is sufficient to describe gravity in the non-relativistic limit. Okay, so that is the kind of simple conclusion that we have drawn by looking at the geodesic equation. Okay, so what we want to do now is to ask a question that we have seen a few things. We have seen that if you pick a particular coordinate system around a particular point, you have sufficient amount of freedom to bring that metric at that point to be flat Minkowski space metric. Okay, so and then we have shown that the geodesic equation around in the neighborhood of any point can be brought into a straight line equation. Okay, so we wanted to ask a question that, like, okay, is there any way of kind of quantifying these quantities, uh, this setup, such that we would know as to how many degrees of freedom that you necessarily have in the system, which you cannot get rid of by, say, doing coordinate transformation. Okay, so locally there are certain things that we could do, but we want to know that we have defined we have defined at least one tensor so far, namely Riemann tensor, and we have defined one non-tensor, which is the Riemann-Christoffel connection. We would like to know that how much degree of freedom really is stored in this set of variables. Okay, so let's see how much we can simplify. Okay, uh, so what we'll do is we'll start with the tensorial transformation property of the metric. So in the primed coordinate system, G prime alpha prime beta prime would be related to G alpha beta through this coordinate transformation, and therefore this tensorial transformation property involving dx alpha by dx prime alpha prime, dx beta times dx prime beta prime times G alpha beta. Okay, fine. So what we can do is we will expand x alpha in terms of x prime alpha prime at a point. Okay, so exactly the way we did some time ago, we'll try to write down x alpha as kind of a function expanded in terms of x prime alpha prime. Okay, so let's choose the value of both these coordinates to be 0 at a particular point P. Okay, then in the neighborhood, if you look at x alpha, that can be written as del x alpha by del x prime alpha times x prime alpha. I should have actually written down x prime alpha prime minus x prime alpha prime 0, but since x prime alpha prime 0 has been assumed to be 0, I didn't have to write that. Okay, otherwise a typical Taylor expansion would have x minus x naught kind of piece sitting around. Our choice of x naught is 0. Okay, so you can write down x alpha in terms of x prime alpha prime through this quantity, and through quadratic piece by taking the second derivative, this subscript p to the parenthesis just says that this derivative after evaluating is to be set at point P. Okay, so you evaluate the derivative, compute the derivative, and then evaluate it at point P. Okay, so this is exactly the way one does Taylor expansion, right? You expand the quantity, you write down x minus x0 to the n upon n factorial times the nth derivative of the function at point x0, okay, which is what we are doing. Okay, so this is the first, this is the second piece which involves second derivative, and then there's a piece which involves third derivative, and so on. Okay, you can kind of keep going, right? So let's look at these pieces, and we want to ask what happens uh, when we do something similar with a metric. Okay, so let's look at G prime at point P and see how we can relate G and G prime to each other. Okay, remember G prime is written like this. Okay, so let's write down that expression. I can write down G prime in this fashion. That on the left hand side, I write down G prime equals G prime at, I should have said at point P really, plus the derivative of G prime at point P times X prime. I'm not writing indices right now because if I write indices, then I have to write down say mu prime here, and then here, and then here, and so on. The expression will just become cumbersome simply because it carries just too many indices. But the main point that we are really getting at is not really that crucially dependent on these indices, but more on identifying quantities and figuring out how we interpret these expressions. Okay. So, so the left hand side is just a Taylor expansion of G prime about a point P. Okay. Right hand side is a Taylor expansion of this expression around point P. Okay. So original expression, of course, del x by del x prime times del x by del x prime times G at P itself. Just substitute the value of the coordinate to be 0. Okay. That is what we have chosen. Whereas at other places you differentiate and then set the quantity to 0. Okay, so there is a term which is linear in X, there is a term which is quadratic in X, and then there would be terms which will higher order and so on. Okay. Okay, so let's kind of try to figure out what we are trying to do here. Okay, first thing is that like we know that the metric is symmetric under exchange of alpha beta. Okay, and so if there are no symmetry in G alpha beta, then alpha would have taken 4 values and beta would have taken 4 values. So total elements in the metric, if you think of that as a 4 by 4 matrix itself, then it has 16 independent entries. Okay, but that's not the case because G alpha beta is symmetric, and because it is symmetric, the total number of independent components are only 10. Okay, which is 4 into 5 by 2. That is how this counting would be done. So diagonal fellows and either upper triangular or the lower triangular set. Okay, and you can check that that would give you 10. On the other hand, this term that we have written down here, dx alpha by dx prime alpha prime, this expression carries two indices, alpha and alpha prime. Okay, so if you think of this as a component of a matrix carrying index alpha and alpha prime, then there is no particular symmetry between alpha and alpha prime. Under the exchange of alpha and alpha prime, nothing special happens, okay, in this expression. So therefore, you would say that it has 16 independent components. It's a 4 by 4 matrix with 16 components, okay, and no particular symmetry, okay. Fine. So we want to utilize these two facts to arrive at certain results, okay. So first thing is that like given that you have 16 components here, you could use these 16 components to bring the matrix G alpha beta into the Minkowski form. Okay. Now G alpha beta contains only 10 components. So in del x by del x prime expression, which contains 16 components, you will not, in fact, not may not, you will not need all 16 components to fix these 10 components. Okay. You may want to look at these 10 components locally. You can set like, several of them to 0, okay, and some other ones to take non-zero value, Okay, given that the metric has to be non-singular, okay, you need minimally 4 quantities to be non-zero. You may have more than 4 quantities non-zero, but minimally 4 non-zero. Okay, so but the thing is that like you should be able to fix those values. Okay, so but out of these 16 parameters, 10 of them are good enough to fix 10 of these guys. Okay, so for example, you can set 6 of out of these 10 to 0, and remaining 4 of them you can just bring it to the form -1 1 1 1. Okay, which is what the eta alpha beta metric is. Okay, so you need only 10 out of these 16 components that del x prime del x by del x prime has. Okay, but we know that once you bring it into the eta alpha beta form, then there exist 6 transformations which are local Lorentz transformation, 3 rotations and 3 boosts, which leave eta alpha beta invariant. Okay, so therefore you understand why there are 16 components. Okay, in spite of only 10 required to bring G alpha beta into eta alpha beta form locally. Okay, so after bringing it to into eta alpha beta form, you can still do local Lorentz transformations, which could be boosts or rotations. Okay, and it would leave this eta alpha beta invariant. Okay, so remaining 6 components of del x by del x prime, okay, basically are just local Lorentz transformations. Okay, is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so then let's go ahead and look at the second derivative term. Okay, so the second derivative term is roughly of this kind, not roughly, it's of this type. Okay, so you have a second derivative of x alpha with respect to x prime alpha prime, x prime beta prime. Now, of course, that is multiplied by x prime, I mean, x prime squared piece. Okay, let me just go back and show it to you. So this is a piece that we are looking at. So it's a x prime squared piece is sitting around. Okay. So this is an expression. And in this expression, there are 3 indices, of course, alpha, alpha prime and beta prime. But because it's a second derivative term, partial derivative, so therefore it is symmetric in alpha prime and beta prime. Okay, you could have taken derivative any which way you want. Okay, whereas x alpha, this alpha index is completely free. Okay, that it is neither symmetric nor antisymmetric with respect to alpha prime and beta prime. In fact, it's a totally different index. Okay, so what we learn is alpha would take 4 values. Okay, whereas alpha prime beta prime is symmetrized. Okay, so therefore it should take 4 into 5 by 2 values. Okay, so this expression totally has 40 components. Okay, in principle it would have had many more components, but because this is symmetric, some of the components are related to these components. Okay, right? So this expression contains totally 40 independent components. Okay, fine. Let us try to compare that with the derivative of the metric. Okay, so derivative of the metric is written like this: del alpha of g beta gamma, and we know that the metric G is symmetric in its indices. It's a second rank tensor and it's symmetric tensor. Okay, so because of that, we have a symmetry in beta and gamma, whereas which derivative you want to take is totally up to you. That has no symmetry property with respect to either beta or gamma. Okay, so therefore alpha can take 4 values uh, because it's a free index, but beta gamma would take 4 into 5 by 2 values. Okay, because of the symmetry property of G beta gamma. Okay, so that means the derivative of the metric would also have 40 independent components. Okay, is that fine? Okay, fine. So notice that we have correct number of components coming from coordinate transformation to set all these 40 components to specific values. Okay, in particular we could choose to set them all of them to 0. Okay, Now, this is nothing, this is in some sense nothing new, because we have already learned this fact that uh, that the first derivative of the metric is not a tensor, and therefore you can always choose a coordinate system in which this non-tensor quantity can be set to 0. Okay. In particular, we have already used a couple of examples in which we have chosen a frame in which gamma, alpha, beta, gamma were just 0. Okay. But gamma, alpha, beta, gamma is written in terms of derivatives of g, alpha, beta. Okay. And in that sense, this fact that now that number of parameters available for to set the first derivative of metric to 0 is exactly right number to get rid of these all components. Okay, fine. But it is kind of good to see explicitly that these parameters are exactly same in number. Okay, fine. So let's go to the next order, and that means look at the third derivative of the coordinate transformation. Okay, so I hope all of you are with me here, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's look at the third derivative. When you look at the third derivative, we are again in the same situation. X alpha has alpha as a free parameter, no symmetry property with remaining three indices. But the three indices which are sitting on the partial derivatives, they are all symmetric. You could have taken derivative any which way you want, in any order. Okay, there is a complete symmetry property between them. So we know that this alpha would give you a factor of 4. This quantity has to be symmetrized in 4 variables. So that's what we will do now. Okay. So what you get is 4 coming from alpha, and this symmetrized quantity is 4 into 5 into 6 by 3 factorial. Okay. So you can compute this. This is not a very difficult computation. You can check that this number is 80. Okay. That's not very difficult because 3 factorial is same as 6. So it just cancels. And then 4 into 4 into 5 is 80. Okay. So these components of the coordinate transformation, which would be related to some 4 component object that we would like to see when we look at the metric. Okay, these components would allow us to kind of set about 80 components of this metric, derivatives of the metric to 0. Okay, that much freedom we have in the coordinate transformation. And what if there are more components in the say second derivative of the metric, then those are the components which we can never set to 0. If there are less components, then of course we have just too much freedom to set the second derivative of the metric to 0. And in fact, if 80 components is larger than the number of components that the second derivative of metric has, then in principle you should be able to set second derivative of metric to 0. Okay, fine. So let's do that exercise now. Okay. So here what we have is a quantity like this. Second derivative of metric, alpha beta is therefore symmetric because this is a partial derivative. And G contains gamma betas, which is also symmetric in gamma beta. So you have a double symmetric structure, symmetric in alpha beta and symmetric in gamma delta. But we know how to do this computation, right? Alpha beta would give you 4 into 5 by 2, and gamma delta will give you 4 into 5 by 2, and you have to take a product of the two because their symmetry properties are not related to each other. Okay, so they are independent statements. This gives you 100 independent components. Okay, 4 into 5 by 2 is 10, so 10 into 10. Okay, so clearly, if we use the coordinate transformation, most general coordinate transformation, then any 4 component quantity, sorry, any 4 index quantity constructed out of metric can be kind of simplified by using the third derivative of the coordinate transformation, but that can simplify out of 100 independent components, it can reduce that to 20 independent components, because maximally you can reduce by 80. Okay, so you'll end up with 20 independent components sitting around in the second derivative of the metric. Okay, and there exists no coordinate transformation because we already used all the coordinate transformation freedom to set as many parameters you could set to 0 as possible. Okay. So these components are independent and no coordinate transformation can touch them. We want to know how do we characterize them. Okay. Is this argument okay? All right. Maybe let me go ahead. Okay. So we want to know ask a question: how do we organize these 20 independent components? Okay. So to understand that, let's consider the symmetry properties of the Riemann tensor. That is the only tensor that we have written down. And we have said one thing, which is when we are studying tensors, that if a tensor is non-zero in one coordinate system, then it is non-zero in every other coordinate system that you can kind of arrive at by doing coordinate transformation. Okay. So therefore, if you have 20 independent components, if you can write them in terms of certain tensorial quantities, then these components will remain non-zero no matter what coordinate system that you would choose. Okay. So that is the reason why we would like to look at tensorial quantities. Okay. If you have a non-tensor, then we have already seen that a non-tensor can be set to 0 in one coordinate system and can be non-zero in some other coordinate system. So there is no invariant meaning to the statement that a non-tensor has certain number of components. Okay, that is a very coordinate choice dependent statement. Okay, so there could always be a frame in which you could kind of increase or reduce the number of independent components of a non-tensor. Okay, this is not something you can do with a tensor. Okay, so good. So this is the old definition, just copied from what we had written down earlier. Okay, uh, and in this definition, there is something we already know, and that is that R alpha beta gamma delta is antisymmetric in gamma and delta. Okay, so let's try to do the following thing. Let's try to simplify our analysis, because we can do this analysis in any coordinate system. Okay, so in particular, we can work in a coordinate system in which gamma alpha beta gamma is 0. Okay, fine. But when I say gamma alpha beta is 0, does not mean that its derivative is 0. Okay. So you choose a point x is equal to say x0, at which gammas vanish, but the derivative of gamma does not vanish. So if you think of that as a function, that function kind of crosses from positive to negative or negative to positive with a finite slope. Okay. At that point. Okay. Fine. So as a result, in the Riemann tensor, the last two terms, which are products of two gammas, you can ignore. But the first two terms you need to keep. Why? Because although gamma itself is 0, its derivative is not. Okay. The point is that, like, if gamma was 0 and its derivative was 0, then the Riemann tensor would have just vanished. Okay. That would correspond to a type of space that can be brought into a flat space form. Okay. You have to find the correct coordinate transformation, but you can bring it into a flat space of interminkowski space form. Okay. Fine. So if you do that, then you can write down the Riemann tensor purely in terms of derivatives of gamma. Okay. What we are interested in is actually looking at a Riemann tensor with all covariant indices. Okay. Now our original definition of Riemann tensor, which is what is written up here, okay, had one index contravariant. Okay, and that was partly because it was written in terms of the uh, Riemann-Christoffel connections, and Riemann-Christoffel connection typically carries one contravariant index. Okay, but we know that indices can be raised and lowered using metric, so we use the metric to lower the index. Okay, fine. So let's do a bit of algebra here and try to see how this expression looks like. Okay, we know how gamma looks like. Okay, so if you want, I can split the screen and show you the form of gamma, but I think by now you should know this. the gamma in this form also, right? Somewhere. No, sorry. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So what we are going to do is basically substitute this form of gamma, okay, for appropriate indices and take derivatives of it. Okay. So now remember gamma contains G inverse times del beta del I mean del of G plus del of G minus del of G kind of expression. Okay. Now, so let's look at partial derivative with respect to x delta of gamma sigma beta gamma. Okay. So if you do that, then the derivative would be acting on G inverse or could be acting on the terms inside the parenthesis. Okay. What I have written here, if you look at it, is all the terms where I have taken the derivative of the terms which are inside the parenthesis. Okay. Only thing that you need to look at is the first row. The second term is the second row actually. Okay. And the reason why I have not differentiated G inverse with respect to x delta is because we have chosen the coordinate system in which gamma is 0. Okay. And if you have chosen the coordinate system gamma equals 0, then the covariant constancy of the metric tells you that the derivative of G should vanish. Okay. I'll come back to this in a moment. I have written it on the next slide. Okay. But before we do that, so I have not taken a derivative of the G sigma whatever. So I have taken rho. So G sigma rho at all. I have just pushed the derivative inside in this parenthesis. Okay. So these are the two expressions. Okay. And all I have done after that is that there is a G alpha sigma, G sigma rho. I use this relation that it is same as delta alpha rho. And then wherever I have rho inside this expression, I have replaced by alpha. Okay. There is of course some cancellation. If you look around, you will find a term which is same on both sides, but has a relative sign. So you can get rid of that piece. Okay. So out of these 6 terms, only 4 of them would survive. Okay. Is that fine? Anyway, in particular, if you want to know the second term here and the second term here would cancel out, then there are 4 terms which are remaining, which are written out here. Okay, fine. Now, this is the argument that I was trying to give, that we do not take derivative of G rho sigma when we have to take derivative of gamma. We just push the derivative across G inverse and acted it on the bracket. And that is the expression that we saw. And the reason why we did not use that was because if the derivative acted on G, then in the gamma equals 0 frame, covariant constancy of the metric would have told you that partial derivative of the metric also vanishes. Why? Because covariant constancy tells you that it is a partial derivative of G plus gamma times G plus gamma times G kind of expression is equal to 0. But gamma is 0 in our frame. And that as a result, you get only partial derivative acting on G, and that is 0 because of covariant constancy. Okay? Fine. So let's go back again and look at this expression so that we can kind of make a statement. Now, to start with, we knew before we brought all the indices into covariant form, okay, even in the original definition of Riemann tensor, we knew that it was antisymmetric in gamma and delta. Okay, bringing one of the index down, namely the contravariant index down to covariant index, does not touch this fact that the object is antisymmetric in gamma and delta. Okay, so this fact continues to hold for a covariant Riemann tensor. By covariant, I mean Riemann tensor with covariant indices. Okay, so therefore, this last expression that we have written down has to be antisymmetric under exchange of gamma and delta, and that you can check. Okay, it's not very difficult to see that, like for example, first term will be related to fourth term and second will be related to third and so on. Okay, under the exchange of gamma and delta. But besides that, you also would find that this expression is antisymmetric under exchange of alpha and beta. So if you swap alpha beta, okay, then you will find that that relation is kind of related to the term with a minus sign. So if you look at the first term and swap alpha beta, you get a third term with a minus sign. And similarly, second term will give you fourth term and there is a sign. Okay. So although Riemann tensor with one contravariant, three covariant indices did not show any other symmetry except antisymmetry in last two indices, in particular gamma and delta, all four covariant indices on the Riemann tensor has a property that it is antisymmetric in first two indices and antisymmetric in last two indices. Okay. In fact, there is one more symmetry that I'll mention right away. I have listed it down there, but like since the form is right here, you can do the following thing. You can replace the pair alpha beta by pair gamma delta. Okay, so wherever you have say gamma written somewhere, you replace that by alpha, and wherever you have delta written there, you replace by beta, and you will find that this expression is symmetric under this exchange. Okay, so if you do a pairwise exchange of first two indices with last two indices, okay, Riemann tensor does not change sign. Okay, so Riemann tensor changes sign under the exchange of first two. Riemann tensor changes sign under the exchange of last two indices also. But if you take pairwise indices, it is symmetric, so it does not change sign there. Okay, fine. So that is the statement. So besides the original symmetry or rather antisymmetry, we also find one more antisymmetry in the complete covariant form, and we also find that pairwise exchange, it is symmetric. So quick summary of what we said is here. R alpha beta gamma delta is minus R alpha beta delta gamma. R alpha beta gamma delta is equal to minus R beta alpha gamma delta, and R alpha beta gamma delta is equal to R gamma delta alpha beta. Okay. So these are the three properties that we looked at. You can check it once again by looking at the expression written out in the gamma equals 0 frame. Now, this is a quick calculation to do simply because we are working gamma equals 0 frame and we are dealing with a tensor. Okay, so whatever property that we have jotted down now is true no matter in which coordinate system you are. So you do a coordinate transformation, gamma is not equal to 0, fine. All covariant indices on the Riemann tensor would continue to have these properties. Okay, any questions? Okay, if not, then let's proceed with this. So there's a small exercise now, and that is that alpha, beta, gamma, delta are four-dimensional indices. So each index can take four values. Okay, take these symmetry properties, of which some of them we knew earlier, but nevertheless they are all listed here. Take all these symmetry properties and compute how many independent components R alpha, beta, gamma, delta has. Okay, so this is a small exercise. Okay, you have to find out total number of independent components this object would have. Okay, now in addition to this, so these symmetries still do not kind of restrict the total number of components of the Riemann tensor, but nevertheless you do this exercise just to find out how much this property, these three properties would kind of restrict independent components. Okay, what is the number? Okay, in addition to that, there is one more property that this Riemann tensor satisfies, and that is the following. you write down R alpha beta gamma delta, hold alpha fixed, and permute beta gamma delta cyclically. That means you write down R alpha beta gamma delta, R alpha gamma delta beta, and R alpha delta beta gamma, and add all of them. If you add all these three, okay, that would give you 0. Okay, so that is an additional condition that a Riemann tensor has to satisfy. Okay, this condition is what is called the algebraic Bianchi identity. Okay, fine. Now there is a small exercise here also, and that is the following: that if you set, you already know that it is antisymmetric in first two indices and antisymmetric in last two indices. So there is no point setting alpha is equal to beta, okay, because it is already antisymmetric, right? Similarly, gamma equals delta, right? But nevertheless, if you choose any two any two indices and set them equal, okay. Now remember, if you set alpha equal to beta here, this would vanish. But if you set alpha equals beta here, this wouldn't vanish because there is no direct symmetry property or anti-symmetry property between first and fourth index or first and third index. Okay. So therefore, you may want to choose any two coordinates here, any two indices here, and set them equal. Okay. And then you check that if you do that, then this expression would vanish identically. Okay. Now let's do one example. You can check it for anybody else. Suppose you take alpha is equal to beta. Okay, then as I said, because of the antisymmetry, our alpha beta gamma delta would just vanish. Okay, but second and third term wouldn't vanish. Okay, because there is no specific symmetry property between first and fourth index, nor is there any specific symmetry property between first and third index. Okay, now there is a property that you exchange first and third index and second and fourth index. Okay, but that is different from having an individual property of exchange between first and third index. Okay, there is no such property available, but it tells you that these two pieces added would give you 0. Okay, but that is kind of obvious because if you look at these expressions, okay, these terms you can kind of try to show are related to each other by earlier properties that we have already studied. Okay, namely antisymmetry properties of these kind. Okay, and this property. So using all the known symmetry properties, you can show that anytime you set two indices equal, okay, remaining piece can be shown to be trivially true because of the existing symmetry properties of the Riemann tensor. Okay, what do we learn from this exercise? We learn from this exercise the following thing, that all the indices sitting on this Riemann tensor for this particular identity, all these indices should be independent. They should be separate values. Because if alpha is equal to beta or if alpha is equal to gamma, this expression is going to vanish identically. Okay. Now, if you are working in 4 dimensions, then 4 indices can just take a unique configuration. If alpha is equal to 1, okay, then beta can take only one of the 3 values. Okay, so suppose you set beta equals 2, then gamma can take only one of the 2 values, kind of stuff. So this is essentially a single equation. See, one component is actually being looked at. Okay, and therefore this algebraic Bianchi identity actually just one additional algebraic constraint. Okay, fine. So the number of degrees of freedom that you would have computed by doing this exercise, okay, as I said, when you do this exercise by using these symmetries, okay, it does not restrict the Riemann tensor completely, okay, but the algebraic Bianchi identity imposes one extra constraint. So the number of independent components obtained by doing this exercise would be reduced by 1 because of the constraint that Riemann tensor in the covariant form should satisfy algebraic Bianchi identity. Okay, fine. Okay, so let me kind of take you back to this equation. Okay, this is an equation which is true, of course, in any coordinate system, but one simple check for the tensor quantity can be done in a frame in which tensor quantity takes the simplest possible form. Okay, and that is the frame in which gamma is equal to 0. In gamma equals 0 frame, we have already written down the Riemann tensor. Okay, so let me kind of roll it, this thing down now. And yeah, I mean, you already know what it is, but I just want to kind of show it on the screen. Yeah, here it comes. Yeah. 0 frame is this expression. Okay. So I won't show the Riemann tensor thing. Maybe I can just pull it up further. Yeah. Okay. So we have this expression. So what you do is you look at this algebraic Bianchi identity, this piece, work in gamma equals 0 frame. Okay. All you have to do is to show that this statement is identically true. Okay. So substitute R alpha beta gamma delta to be this. Then alpha gamma delta beta, you kind of swap indices correctly, plug in this again, and check that term by term, all these pieces will cancel out. So you are really trying to show 0 is equal to 0 expression. Okay, fine. Now the advantage of this is that Riemann tensor is a tensor, so you have shown it this identity to be true in one coordinate system, therefore it's true in all coordinate systems. So we don't need to prove it again. Okay, and in fact we will not try to prove it in any arbitrary coordinate system. We have already proved it in all. Okay, is that fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's kind of go ahead and compare the following thing. So we have seen that there was a mismatch. There were 100 components in the independent components in second derivative of G, and there were only 80 components in the third derivative of the coordinate transformation. Okay, both of them are four indexed objects. Okay, and we thought we could use some of these to set some of these to 0, but 20 are still left over. Okay. So what we want to basically show at the end of the day is that these 20 guys which are left over are the ones which are captured by the Riemann tensor. Okay, so the two exercises that you are going to do are basically establishing that the Riemann tensor has 21 independent components in this exercise. Okay, you of course have to do that check, but that should be the answer. And then there is a single identity coming from here, which tells you that out of these 21, one of them is not independent because of this condition. Okay, one condition, so that should reduce it to 20. So what we have achieved by doing this is that you can use appropriate coordinate transformations to reduce independent components of second derivative of the metric to 20 components, which can be correctly characterized by the Riemann tensor. Okay. So we have figured out how the remaining independent components can be written in a tensorial form, and therefore those components would stay in any coordinate system. Okay, because we have used the tensorial property. Okay, fine. So let's try to define some other tensors starting from Riemann tensor. Okay, so to do that, let's kind of look at one more condition, and this condition is, so far whatever we have looked at are algebraic conditions. Okay, so algebraic conditions reduce the number of components that a tensor has. Okay, this is a differential identity. Okay, so therefore this does not reduce the number of components. Okay, so but if you look at this expression, if you take a covariant derivative of Riemann tensor, then we know that the covariant derivative has a property that it maps a tensor to a tensor. Okay, so Therefore, covariant derivative of Riemann tensor is a tensor again. Okay, but if you anti-symmetrize this covariant derivative with respect to the first two indices of the Riemann tensor, then that equation can be written in this particular form: d alpha of r beta gamma delta sigma plus d beta of r gamma alpha. You can just see they are cyclically being rotated. D beta of r gamma alpha delta sigma are just spectators, plus d gamma r alpha beta delta sigma equals 0. Okay, this identity is known as the differential Bianchi identity. Okay, now so I must say one thing, that like not every book uses this kind of words. I mean, that algebraic Bianchi versus differential Bianchi. Some books do, some books don't. Okay, but it doesn't matter. What is important is that Bianchi identity of this kind, which of course we have studied even in electrodynamics, that epsilon mu nu rho sigma del mu of f rho sigma also equal to 0, which was a statement that there are no free magnetic monopoles, some equations of that kind. Okay, the statements of that kind. This identity is in that category, as against the other one, which was algebraic relation. Okay, and which restricts the number of components. Okay, fine. So again, this identity we can try to prove, and to prove this identity, we will again use the convenient coordinate system, namely work in a coordinate system in which gamma is 0. Okay, if you are working in that coordinate system, then your covariant derivative is just a partial derivative. Okay, so then this entire equation becomes a partial derivative of r summed with cyclically permuted indices is equal to 0. Okay, fine. But we know in the frame in which gamma is equal to 0, what is the form of Riemann tensor? Okay, that is written out here. Okay, so what we can do is we can choose, not choose, we can use really, we can use this form of Riemann tensor, which is the right description in the gamma equals 0 frame. Okay, and we use the fact that covariant derivative reduces to partial derivative in the same frame. We just compute this quantity by taking partial derivative of this expression. Okay, obviously with indices appropriately kind of permuted. Okay, because this quantity is written for r alpha beta gamma delta, whereas in this expression there is no r alpha beta gamma delta. Okay, they are different indices, but yeah, you know how to deal with the indices now. Okay, so good. So to prove this identity, our life is simpler if you work in gamma equals 0 frame. Okay, and since this identity is covariant with respect to general coordinate transformation, it's a fifth rank tensor really being set to 0. Okay, so therefore, if we show it to be true in one coordinate system, we don't need to do this exercise again in any other coordinate system. Our job is done once and for all. Okay, good. So choose this and plug it up there. Okay, so here's the expression. So d alpha, I continue to write capital D here, although I am actually taking only partial derivative. Okay, but I want to write d alpha because it is part of that differential Bianchi identity, so that I can just pick this piece and plug it up there. Okay, I haven't done anything. I have just adjusted indices correctly so that this expression is the expression involving beta gamma delta sigma indices. Okay, and took a d alpha of that. Okay, similarly, you could do this for the other two variables, other two terms in the Bianchi identity. Okay, you can check that these expressions are just appropriately permitted quantities, and if they are not, then that's just a typo. But that's how it should be. Okay, so in case they are not, please let me know. Okay, I have tried to be a bit careful while doing this stuff, but you know, you never know, with so many indices, one could still go wrong. Okay, fine. So what we'll do now is basically push this derivative through at in all these cases and just add the terms. Okay, fine. Okay, so if you do that, you get an expression which is like this. Okay, So now notice one thing, there are like 4 terms each, okay? So you should get like totally 12 terms, which are all written out here, okay? There are some terms which of course cancel trivially, so I think I have cancelled those pieces and then written the pieces, okay? But that's how it is, I think. There are 12 of them, no? Yeah, okay. So I've written down all 12. You can just check individually that these terms would cancel, okay? For example, just look at this piece. Del gamma, del sigma, del alpha of g beta delta is same as the first term, okay? Since they are partial derivatives, you can organize them any which way you want, okay? But there is a relative sign between them, so this term will cancel with this term, okay? So as a first check, you can see that there are 6 positive terms and 6 negative terms, okay? So that is one thing that you should check. And I looks like I have some typo somewhere. Yeah, I think this one of the terms should have been positive, because otherwise there's too many negatives. Okay. Yeah, so this should be positive. Sorry.
I guess it's fine.
Fine.
No. I think there is one wrong. No.
No, the first term is
Oh
also
yeah,
positive.
yeah. Sorry. Yes, thank you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one 6. Okay, and then there are remaining ones. Okay, so you can check that they individually cancel. Okay, so what we have done is basically prove the differential Bianchi identity in a suitable frame in which this computation can be done easily. Okay, and given that statement is a statement about a tensor, because covariant derivative of Riemann tensor. Okay, this statement is true in every coordinate system. Okay, so that's kind of that's proof of the Bianchi identity in arbitrary coordinate system. Therefore, okay, fine. So we can relate this identity to covariant Jacobi identity satisfied by the covariant derivative. Okay, so you can check that by doing the following thing, that that define the action of a covariant derivative on a vector, and in this particular fashion. Okay, so since the vector is a contravariant vector, there is a plus sign when you have a Riemann-Christoffel connection. Okay. Now you consider action of a commutator of covariant derivative. Okay, so far this is only the action of the covariant derivative on the contravariant vector. You take commutator of 2 covariant derivative and act it on a contravariant vector. Okay, so that is just expanded out here, d alpha d beta minus d beta t alpha acting on v gamma. Okay, now just expand this stuff using this expression. So it is, remember, the covariant derivative of a contravariant vector gives you a 1, 1 tensor. Okay, one covariant and one contravariant index. Okay, so therefore the second covariant derivative can be expanded by treating the quantity as 1, 1 tensor, which is what we are doing right now. We expand d alpha as del alpha on d beta v gamma minus gamma with covariant indices, that's a minus sign, and this gamma with contravariant index being replaced by something else with plus sign. Same stuff with d beta acting on d alpha v gamma. So there's a relative sign between them due to commutator, so there is a minus plus minus, but you can check that this expression is just expanding d beta acting on a 1, 1 tensor. Okay, fine. So you can expand this out further. Okay, so here's the further expansion of that. So this is the covariant derivative d beta acting on v gamma, okay, with of course del alpha acting on that. So I can kind of roll down. Yeah. So what we are writing is the following, that just look at the del alpha acting on d beta v gamma piece. if you expand d beta, first piece will be del beta on V gamma and del alpha acting on that is this piece. Second piece would be plus gamma beta gamma, says I will use delta, okay. So gamma beta delta V delta piece, but then a del alpha could act on gamma or del alpha could act on V delta. So these are the two terms when del alpha acting on it, okay. Then comes the other piece. In this piece, of course, you don't have a derivative acting on anything because it is multiplied by gamma. So minus gamma times del rho of B gamma minus gamma gamma piece, because this covariant derivative would have a gamma piece, okay, and that is a term like that, okay. You can systematically follow it up with other terms also. I will not kind of do it for each one of them, but if you do it, you get all these pieces right, okay. But please check this, okay. Fine. So you'll have to, of course, check these pieces. I hope I have not made any typographical error here, but I suppose it's correct. Okay. Fine. So once you do that, then you have kind of expanded out everything. You can look at various symmetry properties of gamma and relative signs between various terms, and you can see that like some of the terms would cancel out, and whatever remains would look like this, okay. So only terms that would remain here are the terms where the derivatives would be either acting on gamma or there are no derivative pieces at all, okay. So there are terms of that kind, okay. For example, this term is a derivative acting on gamma. There is a term here which is 2 gamma and V with no derivative acting on it, okay. So you can check that all the terms in which there are derivatives acting, okay, on V, okay, on the vector, contravariant vector, all those terms should just cancel out, okay. For example, del alpha, del beta would cancel out here, okay. And similarly, if you try to look at del alpha acting on V delta, you will find that term cancels out here, okay. Maybe not this one. No, it's the same one. I will use sigma instead of delta, but it's a dummy index anyway, okay. So once you find that, then only terms which do not cancel are these, okay. But this is something we already know. This is the Riemann tensor, okay. Indices are shuffled, but still a Riemann tensor, okay. We know that the first term with derivative and a positive sign is the last index of the Riemann tensor, okay. That is our notation, that is our convention that we have used, okay. So this Riemann tensor should carry an index alpha as the last one, okay. And then you can check that, you know, it is antisymmetrized between alpha and beta, so therefore beta should be the index before that, okay. That's it. So that tells you that it must be R gamma delta beta alpha times V delta, okay. So commutator of two covariant derivative acting on the contravariant tensor gives you a Riemann tensor, okay. So we'll use this fact to kind of study certain kind of properties of the Riemann tensor next time, or other deriving other tensors from Riemann tensor and so on. So maybe I'll stop at this point today. Any question? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I don't have a doubt.
Okay, so we can close the session today.
Sir?
Yeah.